Good afternoon, or almost afternoon, depending on where you are. My name is Liana Prudencio, and I'm an ORISE researcher in the Office of Groundwater and Drinking Water at the EPA. Welcome to our webinar titled All Rise for Safe Water, Federal and Local Opportunities to Support Manufactured Housing Communities. And I'm going to quickly turn it over to Parker, who's going to give us a rundown of GoToWebinar for those who may not be familiar with this platform. Parker?
Great, thanks, Liana. Hi, everyone, and thank you very much for joining us today. My name is Parker. I work for an EPA contractor called the Captions Group, and I'll be helping facilitate this webinar today. I wanted to go over a couple of housekeeping notes for you guys to help familiarize you with the platform if you've never used GoTo before. So on your device, you should see the presenter screen and a sidebar with a couple of different options. First, you may notice your microphone button should be highlighted red. But because of this webinar size, we're not really going to have you guys unmute yourselves. We'll be doing all of our communications through chat. Speaking of which, you should see either a questions or a chat box, depending on the device that you're using. And this is where you can type in your questions for the presenters. We will have 20 minutes at the end for the presenters to answer some of those questions. You will also see a handouts tab with a copy of the slides if you'd like to follow along or download and revisit the presentation later. Lastly, if you're having any audio issues, please click the audio tab and you use the phone call method to call in via the phone number and PIN code. And I think that's all from me, and thanks everyone, and back to you, Liana.
Great, thank you, Parker. Now I'll first get us started by giving some background on this project. But before that, this is our disclaimer slide that this research is funded in part by an appointment to the Research Participation Program at the EPA, administered by ORISE. And the views expressed by the speakers during these presentations do not necessarily represent the views or policies of EPA. And any trade names or commercial products mentioned do not constitute an endorsement. But why this topic of manufactured or mobile homes? Manufactured housing is a growing industry, with 1 in 7 new homes every year being a manufactured one. It's an affordable housing option. 22 million Americans and counting live in a manufactured home, and these communities are often located in rural areas or within cities in commercial or industrial zones. The American Housing Survey data from Census shows that residents are more likely than the overall US population to be Hispanic or Latino, American Indian or Alaska Native, or of 2 or more races. And previous research has shown that manufactured housing communities experience reduced water service reliability. So for example, they're more likely to experience water shutoffs. And they have a higher likelihood of having contaminant levels in their drinking water that put their health at risk. So that brings us to this project with the goal of improving support to these communities by first better understanding the state of the drinking water systems that serve them, and then also identifying the challenges and needs that they have. And there are 2 parts of this project. First, I use data from the Safe Drinking Water Information System, or SIDWIS, and I've looked specifically at violations of systems that primarily serve mobile home parks. And with this data, I conducted a trend analysis and developed more than 30 maps. And once these maps are finalized, I'll make them available publicly online. And then the second part of this project is what we'll be covering today, the case studies. These case studies serve as examples of manufactured housing communities that were able to overcome Safe Drinking Water Act compliance issues. But before we jump to the case studies, I'd like to first share some of the findings so far for the first part of the project with the SIDWIS data. And as I said, I first did a trend analysis to see what is happening with drinking water violations at these communities over time. And to not overwhelm with 2 tables, I'm going to go over some general findings 1 table at a time. So first, I found that violations are increasing over time for these communities. And these increases are statistically significant. And these are for the 4 categories of violations that I assessed. So I looked at any type of violation, health-based violations, lead and copper rule violations, and total coliform monitoring and reporting violations. But then what about the violations we're resolving or fixing every year? Are we getting any better if we account for those? And the answer to that is nuance. So when we look at new violations every year minus the violations resolved every year, we see that for some of these categories, there is a statistically significant decrease over time. So that means we are fixing more violations than we're accruing, so that's good. But then as you see in this table, there's progress that's happening at different rates. So we're better with some violations over others. And then lastly, I'll point out that the resolved lead and copper violations every year are not outpacing the new lead and copper violations. So perhaps there's some more resources that we should focus on for lead and copper violations. And now to show some findings from the maps. This first map here shows where these systems are, as well as how many people each system serves by the size of the dot. So from glancing at it, you see that these are mostly small systems. In fact, 99.8% serve less than 3,300 people, and 18% serve less than 50. And this isn't too surprising of a finding, but it does give some evidence of why these communities need support. Small systems tend to have less resources than systems that serve larger populations. I also developed various EPA regional and state heat maps. The first two, or the two showing here, are for total violations from 1976 through the second quarter of 2020 when this data was pulled. And with these heat maps, we can identify hotspots where support may be needed. And it's also worthwhile to look at the number of people impacted by violations to account for population differences among states and regions. So these are just a couple of the maps and tools developed, and I'm excited to share these resources and make them available to those who find them helpful. But now let's get to the main event of our webinar. We'll move on to the case studies that will give us a more in-depth look at specific manufactured housing communities. And I'm happy to introduce our guest speakers, Sandy Spiegel, Blake Fogelman, and Melissa Blake. Sandy joins us from the Delaware Department of Health and Social Services, where she serves as the administrator of the Public Health Drinking Water State Revolving Fund. Blake Fogelman and Melissa Blake are from the Louisiana Department of Health. Blake is an infrastructure engineer with the state and is graciously stepping in and presenting Amanda's part today while Amanda was called away for other work duties. Thank you, Blake. And then lastly, Melissa is an attorney and governmental relations professional who focuses on legal and regulatory issues within the Office of Public Health. Thank you very much to Sandy, Blake, and Melissa for presenting and sharing their expertise and experience. I'm going to first pass the mic to Sandy to talk about the Delaware case studies.
Hi, folks. The great state of Delaware here. I'm sharing information on behalf of the Drinking Water State Revolving Fund that's housed in the Division of Public Health under the Department of Health and Social Services. Next slide. I'm Sandy Spiegel. I'm the program administrator for the Drinking Water State Revolving Fund, known as DWSRF. You'll see my email address and program website here. And again, one more time before I say see you later. You'll also see on this slide our state's marine animal, the horseshoe crab. Did you know that Delaware Bay is home to more horseshoe crabs than any other place in the world? Next slide. This is just a little geography, an opportunity to see exactly where Delaware sits in the EPA's Region 3. Next slide. You'll note Delaware's small stature at less than 1 million people. In less than 100 miles, you can be from the top to the bottom of the state, and at its narrowest, it's less than 10 miles wide. I did put a comparison in here for the state of Texas, so you can just see how tiny we are. Next slide. I talk about how tiny we are. We used to be known as the Small Wonder, but recently we rebranded ourselves as the Endless Discoveries. One discovery is that in Delaware, public water systems get their drinking water from the Brandywine, White Clay, and Red Clay creeks, reservoirs, or from groundwater aquifers. Another is that the tallest point in Delaware is only 450 feet above sea level, with the lowest being at sea level. This sets us up for a unique topography, the ability to dig shallow wells comparably, and then some major issues with flooding at times. Next slide, please. Today, I'm going to be telling you about 2 compliance assistance strategies that we used here in Delaware to help manufactured home communities meet drinking water standards. In Delaware, manufactured housing is a very critical source of affordable housing, especially as home ownership for low-income households. A little over a decade ago, the State Housing Authority estimated that almost 41,000 units, so 41 mobile homes, are home to approximately 70,000 Delawareans, and this constitutes about 10% of the state's housing stock. So you can imagine that's a pretty big population. Also, as small as we are in Delaware, any sort of impact that we make through these strategies that I'm going to tell you about are very impactful because we are so small. Today, we'll talk about 2 of the manufactured home communities, which we'll call MHCs throughout, or I might refer to as a mobile home park or a trailer park, but I try to refer to them as MHCs. The first one's Forest Park, and the other one is Holiday Pines. Next slide. So first I'm going to start with Forest Park. This park is located in one of our 3 counties. Delaware's so small, we only have 3 counties. It's our most southern county, Sussex County. And this project is going to illustrate a collaborative effort between the EPA, our program, DHSS, and then the Delaware Rural Water Association. I know that there are rural water associations throughout the country, and they are a great resource, as you'll see moving through this presentation, for technical assistance. This project is going to return compliance to a MHC utilizing the services of the Delaware Drinking Water or the Delaware Rural Water Association. The system funded the nitrate removal and upgrades that you'll hear about 100%. So the system did fund the mitigation and the upgrades. The DWSRF set-aside activities that include technical and small assistance were used in this instance. You can see an abbreviated version of that on your slide. So $0 from the DWSRF, and then just using the technical assistance that's already available. This Forest Park has 46 persons and 25 connections. Next slide. So this is a family-owned park. Basically, we had to use a kitchen table approach and third-party assistance to get the help that we needed to get these folks into compliance. This is where the technical assistance and set-aside activities come in. Compliance history showed over 15 years of mixed issues, including nitrate exceedances. There's no lead and copper monitoring. There's no certified operator. There's no provision of consumer confidence reports. Next slide, please. So when we start looking at the EPA date of notice of violation, you can see that that is in March of 2017. And then the date of the administrative order is July of 2017. And then the date of the closeout letter, November, December 2017. You'll see that it took less than 9 months to reach compliance with the drinking water standards after the DWSRF stepped in to assist. Next slide. So this is just going to show a little bit of the timeline to compliance. So I'm just going to go through, I think there's about 5 slides. So this is 2017. Next slide. You'll see that EPA Region 3 contacts our program, the Delaware DWSRF, for assistance in May. It took less than a week for a coordinated conference call between Region 3 EPA folks. And then this would be 3 different sections or offices within Division of Public Health, our DWSRF, our Office of Drinking Water, and then our leadership in the Health Systems Protection Program. Still, again, within less than a week, we have a meeting with the Forest Park owner, who apparently was willing and just didn't have the resources they needed. The Delaware Rural Water Association is what you'll see, DRWA, and then Source Water Protection with our Department of Natural Resources. 2 days later, the owner is already in contact with water treatment companies to get some of the beginning testing done for preliminary consults, and then the Delaware Rural Water begins working on the consumer confidence reports. Next slide. All right, so now we're in June. It's not very far into June, and the water treatment contractor is selected. Lead and copper samples are getting collected. A week later, a floor is converted in the shed to be prepped for concrete installation. And then again, you can see just about every week there's movement. Consumer confidence reports are reviewed by the Office of Drinking Water. A contract was signed with a water treatment contractor, and then the lead and copper sampling plan started. Next slide. So now we're in July, a couple of weeks later. You can imagine they had a holiday in there and some time where people probably weren't available, but constant movement on this project. Plans are received by the Office of Engineering for the nitrate removal equipment installation. By the end of the month, the equipment is installed, and then the next month, the consumer confidence reports compliance is finally achieved, nitrate compliance achieved, and the owner completed the sampler tester course at the end of August. Next slide. So this just shows how long it took the Delaware Rural Water Association to connect with, well, in connection with Forest Park to get them into compliance. So they reported to us that they made 10 site visits totaling 21.5 hours, and this didn't include phone calls and email correspondence with treatment contractors and regulatory officials, and then the consumer confidence report preparation. The Delaware Rural Water Association really worked as a technical assistant for this park owner, this MHC owner, to help get them into compliance. They just needed someone to hold their hand along the way. Next slide. This is our next example. So Holiday Pines, MHC. This is an example of a compliance assistance strategy where we use consolidation. So the last one, we call that our set-aside strategies, and this one's consolidation. We help the system to meet compliance with the drinking water standards. So from what I gather, the MHC belonged to a couple of brothers. There was non-compliance issues, and at some point, one of the sons inherits the park. The son begins to charge a fee to the residents of the MHC for drinking water, and in turn is sent a correspondence from the Public Service Commission, PSC, noting that he has a requirement to meet Public Utilities Act of 1974 if he's going to charge for public water. So investigations ensue. I got to read all of the transcripts for that. And then the PSC files a docket for unlawfully operating as a public utility. A commissioner's order follows. Next slide. At this point, a notice of intervention is filed by Tidewater Utilities Incorporated. Apparently, Tidewater holds the CPCN, the Certificate of Public Convenience and Necessity, for that area. It means that they're the lawful owners of the water being supplied to Holiday Pines and being currently charged for by the owner. A second intervention petition is filed by Tidewater just a short time later, and then a commissioner's order is filed, granting Tidewater the ability to serve the community and install the infrastructure as such, and requiring the recalcitrant owners to relinquish rights and provide that they can't provide water, and to legally abandon the wells and distribution system that they had in place. This resulted in a DWSRF loan to Tidewater for the infrastructure project in the amount of $1.5 million. Next slide. So what you'll see for this regionalization, this interconnection bolsters managerial capacity, provides storage, and a more consistent water source and fire protection. Sometimes I've found in Delaware, when you talk to manufactured home community owners, they don't realize when they start managing MHCs that they're in the water business. It wasn't their intentions. And so a lot of them don't mind tying into regional sources so as to not have to worry about becoming a water operator. Next slide, please. Overall, this project relieved the owner of a burdensome and antiquated water system, which he had inherited and had no intention of really figuring out how to run purposefully and safely and in line with the Safe Drinking Water Act. Next slide. So today I shared quickly 2 different compliance assistance strategies. One, using our set-aside activities, including especially our technical assistance set aside with the Delaware Rural Water Association, and then regionalization, which is something we push for, especially in these cases where there is a big utility that might be very close to these smaller community water systems. Next slide. I want to say many thanks to my predecessor, Ms. Heather Warren, for her passion and hard work for these communities, as I am sharing her work today. I'm new to this position, and this work was completed prior to my onboarding. So her passion for MHCs and what it means to us in Delaware. Like I said, we're a small state, and so any impact that we make can be seen, pretty easily, pretty visibly. You'll see my email address and my website here if you need to reach me or if you have any questions. And I thank you all for joining.
Thank you, Sandy.
Thank you.
And now we'll quickly jump to the Louisiana case studies with Blake and Melissa.
Thank you. Thanks again, and I do apologize for our last minute substitution. Amanda was called away to something else. But I am Blake Fogelman, infrastructure engineer for the Louisiana Department of Health. My main focus here at the state is supporting sustainability in rural systems across the state. We have roughly 1,200 or close to 1,300 water systems in the state of Louisiana, and roughly 900 of those are considered rural. So a lot of what we do, we work in between a lot of the funding agencies within the state and federal partners, as well as our loan program in-house in supporting different ways. I think today, Melissa Blake was brought on board around the same time that I was, and she's been an integral part in assisting us through our rules and our laws and our enforcement actions to gather those together and really push in a similar direction. Part of what we do is our shop houses regulating sewer as well. So I know across the states there's many different ways. I think our industry is kind of split up. So LDH monitors and reviews plans for both water and sewer facilities. LDEQ, Department of Environmental Quality in the state, actually handles the effluent permits and things like that. So in a lot of times, especially in these in municipalities as well as these mobile home communities, we are dealing with both water issues as well as sewer issues on the same page. Next slide, please. So overall, what we're doing now, this is just today we're going to speak more about the judicial process and how this helped in our case study. But some of the things that are happening in Louisiana through our loan program, we have a consolidation initiative. That's something I'm very involved with in working with regionalization and supporting economy of scale in areas that have the ability to do so. We started receiving some of this money and set aside this money in 2019. And since then, we've closed 4 loans over the past year, totaling about $9 million in capital investments. These loans that we're providing are 100% forgiven. So the baseline of the requirements for this is if one system is in good standing and their neighbor has an administrative order or has some kind of enforcement action, if they are willing to merge in all capacities, in managerial, technical, and financial capacities with that neighboring system, the state is willing to put up the capital funds to make the improvements so that both systems can be successful and work together. So that inactivated 4 systems that were actually out of compliance, and quite frankly, were out of compliance for some time. Then our next strategy has been, making orders executory and getting them in front of a judge. That is our pathway. That is one of our our only pathways when it comes to getting it heard and actually getting some attention to these orders. DEQ, on the other hand, has a whole criminal side, whereas LDH does not. And so we kind of have different pathways on encouraging improvement through our orders and through our enforcement. And then actually, as we speak, there are some legislation that's happening at the Capitol right now and being discussed that it would potentially give our department additional consolidation authority under certain stipulations and certain requirements. There's a bill right now that rather than the CCR yearly that looks like a lab report, the legislators are asking that we put a letter grade to that and give some more tangible understanding to the people that drink this water and understand that if I have, if my system's an F and my neighboring system's an A, why can't I have A water? Those types of things make it easier for them to understand. And then improve receivership authority. So Louisiana currently has the ability to go to a judge and ask for a receiver to come in and run a water system that's failing. But it's very limited in the authority. And so the biggest issue we find is that it doesn't have the authority from a financial standpoint. So they have to take what's currently coming into that water system and try to make do. And a lot of times, as we all know, what they're taking in is subpar to what they need as far as maintenance and capital investments. And so there is some legislation on the board right now that would give a little more authority to those receivers. Next slide, please. So what we're going to talk about today is a mobile home community in a part of the state near New Orleans on the North Shore. In Louisiana, we have parishes, not counties, but it's all the same. It's in St. Tammany Parish. So as I mentioned before, we have close to 1,300 water systems. In St. Tammany alone, we have close to 400 water systems. So we have 64 parishes or counties, however you want it, in the state, and one of those has nearly a third of our water systems. Part of this is because there's abundant groundwater in that area. There's a lot of independently minded systems. A lot of businesses have their own water systems and things like that. But as we all know, it's difficult for smaller systems and may be difficult for smaller systems to keep up with our minimal chloride residuals, ammonia, iron, manganese, organics, all these things that take additional treatment to handle. It becomes very expensive for a small customer base. In this specific case of the mobile home community, we're going to review. In 2005, Hurricane Katrina, as many of us know, came through New Orleans and did a lot of damage. There was a lot of FEMA funds and a lot of support from the national level, and a lot of people got into the business of being mobile home managers through funding in FEMA. And so a lot of that was that was very quick after the storm, and you'll see by the timeline how quick the turnaround was. So in 2005, it hits. There's typically no match required when there's any damage caused. There was quick construction, so it's difficult to oversee that it's being put in properly. And then a lot of these, it's deferred maintenance really catches up with them. Due to the small customer base, obviously it's difficult to overcome the increased financial cost. Next slide, please. So here's it is an RV park, or at least it's considered to be an RV park by name, but it's serving 87 people. It's roughly 29 connections. You can see the front of it. It's typical. If anyone knows and anyone has been to Louisiana, those mobile homes that you do see are the typical ones that were distributed during Hurricane Katrina by FEMA. And so a lot of this area currently is still served by mobile homes that were distributed in 2005, 2006, and have just been here for that amount of time. Part of it is you can see the U-shaped drive in the footprint of the system. The owner actually lives in the house directly to the right side of that picture. That is just to note they're there living right behind it with a 2-story house and a pool. And so it was obvious. It's obvious in this case that they had the means to invest and support this water system in this mobile home community. And so through our process, I think we got some attention and got them to do so. Next slide, please. So as a history, as I mentioned in 2005, this is where the funds came in to put in improvements after the hurricane. But unfortunately, even since 2006, they've had violations throughout its history. It was smaller ones that were addressed until 2015, where they started getting some significant deficiencies and some major water quality violations. It was at that time, this is all prior to Melissa's onboarding with the state, but it was brought to a district court with an injunction and granted against those the co-owners. It's a husband and wife. And the rule for contempt filed in 2016. And so in 15 and 16, through our normal process, we were able to get some attention. And they did make some repairs, and it lasted about 2 years. And then obviously you can see between 2018 and 2020, there's a pretty lengthy list of pretty bad things going on, and it's just there was not a lot of attention given to us and the severity of what we were trying to impress upon these owners. Even we had to issue a ball order, not an advisory, but a ball order in 2019 due to our findings. And I'll show you a little bit of what we found throughout this process. Next slide, please. So here's the list of the violations. Just on the water side, and I'm going to get into the sewer side because it all plays into how we were able to garner enough attention to get some change. So on the wells, there's no flow meter, there's no second source for a well or even a second source tied into a different water system. No monitoring plan really done well, the incorrect sampling locations, no proper sampling taps. I think I even have a photo in here. That's going to show you a little bit of what they were attempting to pass for a tap. Chemical feed, there's no secondary containment. They were having difficult times maintaining their chlorine residuals. There's times where we do inspections and the chlorine or the Clorox that they were using tank was not even, they didn't even have any in it. They were just pumping water out of the ground. No calibrations and incorrect dosing size and equipment for that. The pneumatic tank didn't have a bypass, didn't have any kind of control equipment. And then much like we would expect and what was presented through Delaware's cases, the CCCP, the O&M manual, even the CCR at times were not being kept up with properly. The biggest one that I would say that has effect on all these other ones is that they were not carrying a certified operator. They didn't have anybody on site that understood the importance of all these other things that we're discussing. Next slide, please. So here's an overview of the site, and so if you can click through some of these, it's going to stay on the slide. But the blue box right there is actually where the well site is. It's in a little room next to, I guess, kind of crammed in between a couple different buildings. And then the next one, there's a shot of the well that's coming out into the motor. To the left is the hydromatic tank. No flow meter, no controls on it. Then the triangles are where our sample locations are throughout the site, where we're going to take our monthlies and kind of rotate around taking monthlies. And then I think actually the next click will show you that is what's was going as a sample site. On the right side, it's teed off, and on the right side, that's somebody using a garden hose. I think that actually went to someone's trailer. They just piped it straight to the trailer. On the left side is actually a smooth nozzle tap, but as you can see, there's maybe it was dripping or something, and they actually had a rag stuffed into it. Maybe they're trying to stop bugs from getting in it. I don't know. So this is the type of equipment we were seeing out there. Might have been built to some standard back in 2005, but anything that we have current, obviously this is not what we want to see in a water system. Next slide, please. So in On the sewer side, sewer violation history in 2019 is when a lot of the violations began. And so much like we issue administrative orders for water compliance, we do have compliance orders that are issued from our end on that. So the order was made executory, which is a big step, made it executory and got in front of a judge in the district court at that time. Next slide. So the violations that they had on the sewer system, the main ones where they were having some sanitary sewer overflows, SSOs, due to broken pipes and lack of upkeep of their system. And then a lot of time, once you walk down that pipe, you realize that things didn't look right. And so we realized there was a lot of equipment not maintained in its proper form as it was permitted. So therefore, they weren't even meeting a DEQ permit. In fact, they didn't have a current DEQ discharge permit. And it's because they weren't running the equipment the way they were supposed to run it. So as you can see in the sewer collection, they had repairs, they had lines exposed, all their sewer caps and things were open. They didn't have any chlorination equipment. They had no security fencing around their ponds. They didn't have a certified operator. As you saw the aerial, it's a very small footprint. They had very small children that were living in that area and playing every time we went to that site. Safety was a big concern with all of this exposed sewer pipes and sewer equipment. Next slide, please. So just to give you some, we had I think it was I had 17 E. coli positives in a 2-year span. There was a big concern because if you could see the sample sites, you kind of understand where all the piping is for the water. I think if you click again, if you advance the slide one more time, it'll show up these red lines. Those red lines were where we found either broken and/or exposed sewer lines. So they're in proximity not only of the well, but obviously of the main portion of trailers that are housed at this site. So there was significant concern once we found all this out. Next slide, please. Oh, I'm sorry. And then the green box at the bottom is actually the location of the treatment pond. It's a 2-cell aeration pond in the lower right-hand corner. So on the left side, there is the pond originally. And we're going to come back to this photo and maybe a little bit smaller, but you can't even see right in the front of the picture is actually one of the cells. You can see the one in the back, but the one in the front is one of the treatment cells that is completely grassed over and grown through. There's actually in the back cell a full-blown tree growing out of the middle of the pond and growing up. On the top right side is service connections. You can see they're broken. They just laid tin over the tops of them where they were broken. There's exposed clean outs. And then on the bottom, we tracked the piping through the community and found more broken. It wasn't buried deep enough originally. Obviously, somebody rolled over it and cracked some of this pipe. So not only were they exposing to sanitary sewer overflows, but they were obviously taking on a ton of water and trying to handle and treat that. And so even if they were treating it properly, the amount of water they would have to treat just to do it justice would be a significant financial cost and cause issues on that side as well. Next slide, please. So this is when all this was, I guess not discovered, but when it all kind of came to a head, and actually Melissa was brought on board to specifically help the engineering side of OPH, which is our Office of Public Health, and really brought a fresh take to how we could use the judicial system to support cases like this. And so at this point, I'm gonna turn it over to Melissa and let her elaborate a little bit on how that process went moving forward.
Thank you, Blake. I appreciate that. And I appreciate you allowing me to speak today at this webinar regarding some of the judicial approaches that Louisiana has taken recently. I've been at the Louisiana Department of Health for about 1 year now, and we started by looking at some of the most egregious cases and those that had had violations for a long extended period of time. and this one was already a part of the court process. So I started looking for kind of novel and unique ways of getting the attention of negligent owners. And so in 2020, we had the unique opportunity, because typically we only see court cases, one involving water and the separate court case involving any sewer violations. So if you actually do have the opportunity where a particular system is in a court system with both violations, there's a unique opportunity to have those consolidated. And it becomes particularly egregious when you get in front of one judge. And that way, once all of your orders are executory and they're now able to be moved forward on in a court system, you're able to file a rule for contempt on both, which is what we did in 2020, and move this particular water system in front of one particular judge. Next slide, please. So as we had previously talked about, this mobile home was particularly vulnerable and had contaminant issues, no certified operator. And because it had been going on for such a long extended period of time, these owners went from becoming negligent and sporadic with their compliance issues to more of an intentional degree. And so when we went to trial on this, it becomes more of a threat to the public health, and a judge has a particularly vested interest in his constituents that he's trying to provide safety for, that he represents. So when you take it to a judge in this manner, it's a way of presenting evidence on sewer violations, water violations, showing the photos. And you're not always going to have the type of evidence that we would have in this particular case. Hopefully you will. But we had children, photographs of toys, for example, children's bicycles, children's play equipment in raw sewage, and water that was clearly not able to, you can't drink the water whatsoever. So when a judge hears from expert witnesses and the wonderful professional engineers we had to testify on our engineering team, it was quite easy for him to see that this had moved to an intentional effort on the part of these owners to not care about the safety of their mobile home units. And the guilty verdict came, and because this was a contempt proceeding, the judge had already issued an order in this case, meaning when these owners continued to violate these rules and regulations, they were no longer just violating state Department of Health rules and regulations. They were actually violating a judicial court order, which, as we all know, judges don't take kindly to that. So he ordered the maximum penalty for that offense, which would have been 30 days in prison and a $1,000 fine. So we were able to get that maximum sentence, and this 30-day prison sentence was to take place starting December 1st through December 31st, a rather inconvenient time for these owners. So it was really able to get the attention of these owners, and it was set precedent that we were able to get a prison sentence for owners for this lack of safety and consideration at all for these constituents. So after the 30 days was suspended, you can go to the next slide. We immediately saw that within those 30 days prior to their having to report to prison, you'll see in green here, this is the same slide you saw earlier, every single violation, all 15 water and all 11 sewer violations were corrected. So as we pointed out before, sometimes it takes some dramatic measures to actually get the attention of people who would rather not spend the month of December in prison. Next slide, please. You can see some of the current status photos, some of the before and after, kind of what Blake was referring to earlier. Things were corrected, and it kind of goes to show that not only is it precedent setting and can definitely is something that will use as a tool going forward, but the court system is definitely a must when it comes to owners. When the simple, violations that are issued, orders that are issued, laws of the state sometimes don't mean as much until you're actually in front of a judge. And these homeowners are constituents, and these judges have a vested interest, and as does the Department of Health, of course, but he is there to ensure and secure that these citizens are protected. And by consolidating the cases, making it more efficient, and showing the depth and the egregious nature, you're able to move things much quicker. And you see that within 30 days, numbers of violations that had been pending for years were quickly able to be corrected with little to no issue for this low-income community. And we were also able, if you go to the next slide, part of the judgment we wrote that not only all the violations were to be remediated, all their fines were paid, and as I said, the sewer and the water issues were all remediated, but we were able to get as part of the judgment that there be a full year of compliance with no future violations. Therefore, we can return to court at any time within an entire year on these contempt charges if any future violations are discovered. So they're at a heightened level of monitoring due to that. And I realize not always sewer violations can be a part of water violations, but either way, if you have a case such as this, when it becomes so egregious and owners move from that negligent area more to an intentional non-compliance, this is definitely one of the strategies that Louisiana has chosen to embark on, use as a strategy as far as the judicial system, because it moves quicker and it has a lot more teeth that sometimes we as states in the regulatory realm don't always have at our fingertips. And as was mentioned earlier, we have written some legislation that is on the books, hopefully will be passed this month to kind of strengthen some of those. But in the meantime, it's always a good idea to try to get in front of a judge, because it becomes not just a violation of state statutes, state regulations, but it becomes a violation of a judicial court order, and prison time is allowed for those kind of violations. So it raises the stakes, it raises the compliance, and it does so much to ensure the safety and security of our citizens. So that's all I have. If you have any questions, I'll be glad to answer them.
And Melissa, just to add to that real quick, I know that this is one of our extreme cases. I know we, I guess as compared to Sandy's presentation about their involvement with communities that were actually supportive and just needed that resource. We also, obviously our first step was to reach out with regionalization and technical assistance. Obviously, the span of this, we've been dealing with the same owners in this very case. There's a few across the state that are like this that have refused and turned away and ignored at every step of the way. So we do have many systems that are engaging the other strategies. This is just one that has not been done before and that has actually gotten positive action. Much like we say on our fines, on our administrative orders, that's money that could be spent in the water system. That's where we want it to be spent. We're just going to the full extent of our authority when you're going to ignore public health. And so this is one of those extreme cases, but as we did mention, we have 4 or 5 others that have gone down regionalization, and we also do contract out with our set-asides for technical assistance with our rural department, our Rural Water Association as well. So, but we do appreciate it, and thanks for your time.
Great, thank you to Sandy, Blake, and Melissa again for sharing these different approaches. Yes, it was nice to highlight different types of approaches. So Sandy showing more of the drinking water state revolving funds approach, and then also showing more of a local or state level judicial approach with the Louisiana case study. So thank you very much for highlighting those. And please feel free to continue asking questions. I'm going to go ahead and search through some of these and see what questions we have for our presenters so far. let's see, I see one question for Melissa and Blake. How long did the whole process take to obtain a guilty verdict and make corrections?
I'll take that. As far as the legal, we started the consolidation in late 2020, and we had all remediation done by, like I said, throughout the month of December, and by January of this year, it was remediated fully.
Yeah, and I would say, I think that keep in mind when we talk about 2020, right? That was in the middle of full swing of the pandemic and lockdowns and the whole 9 yards. So I know Melissa and her team kind of jumped through hoops to get in front of a judge at that time. So theoretically could have been done even quicker if the timing was right.
Great. And then another question for Melissa and Blake. Any idea what their legal costs were versus the actual infrastructure repair costs?
Their legal,
Yeah, go ahead, Melissa.
I'm not sure what their legal, I mean, they had an attorney representing them. They had several attorneys representing them throughout the course of these executive decisions as well as the contempt trials. But their fines, as you can see, the maximum allowed by law was $1,000. So that's not a very large cost, but apparently they were able to remediate all water and sewer issues with minimal cost as well.
Yeah, we don't, from the engineering standpoint, I don't know that we have any kind of estimate on the amount of money they put into the work.
Great, thanks. Deborah and Parker, I know I saw questions for Sandy earlier, but I'm not able to spot them. If you can read a couple of them.
Yeah.
I was gonna say I could read them if you like.
Okay,
ahead,
yeah, for some reason, yeah.
Oh, where did they go?
Yeah, see, I noticed
Yeah, I'm not sure. It looks like they were answered, but we can ask them out loud. I have access to them.
Okay.
Oh, you do.
Yeah, I can still see them. This is a question for Sandy. How was the nitrate removal treatment funded, and what was the cost?
Yes. So, oh, I can see the questions now. What was it? So the owner of the manufactured home community supplied the funding, and this project preceded my tenure. So I don't know if they just had like a capital improvement plan at the manufactured home community, if he had to take out a loan. I'm not sure, but it was not DWSRF funding. And then unfortunately, I also don't have knowledge of the cost, but I would be willing to share the information following this presentation if there's a way that Liana can share it with. Victoria Heath is the person who asked that question. The next question, what nitrate treatment technology did you select for such a small system, POUs or other? Again, I don't have intimate knowledge of this, but I can follow up with the technical assistance provider that was on the case, and they would be able to share that with Robert, Gavin, and whoever else, if we can send out a follow-up email. Liana, how could we do that? Could you send it directly to the asker, or is there a way to send it to the group if I get those answers?
Yes, I believe the registration has email addresses, so I should be able to reach out.
And then what other question? For Holiday Pines, Mary Gieske asks, if they would not have charged separately for water and had just kept it in the rent, would they have had to connect to a larger system? So my understanding is that charge, the gentleman actually walked around with literally a bucket and was collecting money. If he hadn't done that and upset somebody who filed a grievance with him at the Public Service Commission, it wouldn't have triggered it at the time. It doesn't mean that it wouldn't have happened later. I can imagine that once the private utility who owns the CPCN for that area determined that the MHC was providing service from their servicing area, it would have occurred later time. But it probably would have been a different method than all the investigations, which I've heard took years. For Holiday Pines, somebody asks, when regionalization or consolidation occurs, Oh, it's Mary again. Does the MHC pay for any of the costs to do this? So for the Holiday Pines regionalization, I know that the MHC did not incur the cost of the consolidation or any sort of distribution work, distribution system work. However, I don't know whether the MHC incurred the costs that were associated with needing to abandon the well and distribution system that had been in place. The DWSRF loan in the amount of 1.5 million was awarded to that private utility that had taken on the MHC. Question for Sandy from Aaron Dodge. When using regionalization strategy, do the MHCs upgrade their infrastructure in the community? So in my 10 months and the experience that I've seen, I know for the two that we're talking about today, infrastructure to the community definitely happened with the regionalization project. I don't know that it had to occur for the set-asides project. Oh wait, well you said upgrade anyways. So the regionalization, the other ones, the only time I definitely see upgrade to the infrastructure is when they need to meet code for fire suppression as well, or if the distribution system doesn't meet code, has is really old or has leaks and things like that. But I've seen it a lot when they need to come up to code to put inline fire suppression systems in. There's a question from Heather. Is a privately owned supply such as the MHC allowed to seek a loan through DWSRF in Delaware? So private and government owned public water systems can apply for DWSRF loans. We just don't fund projects for private wells. So there's a minimal, maybe it's 25 connections to be considered a community water system in Delaware. I would have to double check with our Office of Drinking Water for that. But once you hit that, you qualify as a public water system, which is something that I can provide funding through the DWSRF. I think that's it for Sandy.
Thanks, Sandy. Yeah, I see them now. They weren't with the green flags. Okay, thank you. Let's see, there's another question for Melissa and Blake. Let's see, was the Louisiana park owner made aware during all the violation occurrences that if they continued to not remediate this situation, that legal action would be taken?
Yes, legal action was taken throughout the years, as you'll be able to see if you look at the PowerPoint from the history of the violations started. They're made aware all along the process. They had an attorney starting in 2015 and 2016 as soon as their contempt started with the water violations. And when we consolidated the sewer violations in, they were they brought on a second attorney and a new attorney to assist them throughout the judicial process.
Great. And then one last question for Melissa and Blake is that you talked about how this sets precedent for Louisiana, and that this is an approach that you would look to in the future if need be. And I'm curious, are there a lot of cases you think that this approach would apply?
We typically see it only when we find the most egregious cases, when there's been a long history of non-compliance and we feel that the actions are not being remediated, and it becomes not just a negligence issue, it doesn't become a monetary issue, it's more of an intentional abuse issue of these particular parks and of these particular residents. So this is obviously the far extreme, but we do have some that have been on such a prolonged basis that this would be a viable option going forward.
Great. Well, thank you again to all who attended, and thank you. Special thanks to our presenters, Sandy, Melissa, and Blake. And we will be sending out a link to where you can view this webinar again. This was recorded, and then we also have our slides available in the handouts, and we'll put them online as well and send you a link to them online. Thank you all for joining.